To create an extrusion in SOLIDWORKS, first we have to start with a sketch. To do that, we'll first select the front plane from the Feature Manager design tree and choose Sketch. This can also be accessed from the Sketch tab in the Command Manager. To start with, we're going to use the Polygon tool and set it to a number of sides of 3. And we'll just leave the inscribed circle option checked and click it into the origin and drag it out. When creating an extrusion, SOLIDWORKS looks for a closed profile to create that extrusion from. So if we go into the Features tab and select Extruded Boss Base, it's going to see that we have this one closed profile and allow us to create an extrusion from that. If we go back in the sketch by canceling and we add a line, SOLIDWORKS is now going to see that we have the closed profile as well as this open profile on the outside. When we go into the Features tab once again and choose Extruded Boss Base, it's not going to know off the bat what profile we'd want to use for an extrusion. It automatically brings you into this box called Selected Contours, which allows you to select out profiles within the sketch. If we hover over the inner area of the triangle here, we can select out that same profile and create that same extrusion. You may run into an error message from time to time when working with extrusions. If you, for example, create an extrusion, let's say from this closed profile, and then go back in and edit the sketch, and let's say we add a line to the side here, you can see we get this error message, cannot rebuild the feature using this sketch. The reason for that is it now sees multiple profiles, so it doesn't know which one to use. If we go ahead and say cancel and delete that line out, then that extrude feature will rebuild fine. If we right click and edit our extrusion, if you had used the Selected Contours feature instead, then we could add profiles to the outside of the sketch without receiving that error. So just keep that in mind when working with extrusions and working with multiple profiles within sketches. I'm going to go ahead and delete out this extrusion just by right-clicking on it and going to delete. Next, we'll be modifying this profile. You can do that by editing the sketch. You can either click on the sketch and go to Edit Sketch, right-click on one of the lines in the sketch, choose to Edit Sketch, or you can just double-click on a sketch entity and it'll bring you back into the sketch. To make this a little bit easier to work with, I'm going to get the normal view to this profile. I'll just do that by hitting the spacebar and double-clicking Normal to. You may have noticed the inscribed circle has dashed lines rather than the solid lines you see on the sides of the triangle. And the reason for this is that this is a construction geometry. If I click on it, you can see it has this construction geometry option selected. And you can also find that option on the left. What that means is that this geometry functions the way any other sketch entity would, but when we go to create an extrusion or another feature, it's not going to look at any of our construction geometries. It's only going to look at the solid lines. You'll also notice that all of these lines are blue, and in the bottom right corner you'll see a statement that says underdefined. That means we can still move our sketch around, change these entities as we like. Once we've created the necessary dimensions and relations, you'll see these lines turn black, and this message will change to fully defined. So first I'm going to click on this top point, Control-click the origin, and choose the option to make vertical. That'll now keep the top point of the triangle from moving from side to side. Next I'll add a dimension, You may notice me switching between using the Command Manager buttons and the Shortcuts bar buttons. In order to access the shortcut bar, you just press S, but it's the same buttons on the Shortcuts bar as it is on the Command Manager. So I'll just go ahead and choose the Smart Dimension tool. And I'm going to choose this top point and the bottom line there to create a height of 4 inches. And you may have just noticed that all those lines now change to black because that is now fully defined. Next, I want to convert the lines on the triangle to construction geometries as well. And I'll just select all 3 lines by holding down Control and clicking all 3 lines. And from there, I'll choose the construction geometry option. The next tool we want to use is called the 3-point arc. That can be found in the arcs dropdown. Just choose 3-point arc. And I'm going to click this in at the top, at that bottom corner, and just arbitrarily outside of the triangle. Then I'll once again grab the Smart Dimension tool, click on the arc, and give this a radius of 9 inches. You may have noticed I only typed a 9 into the Smart Dimension. If I double click on it again, you'll notice that it populated the inches. For the Smart Dimension tool, it'll automatically populate what the units are in the document properties. If instead you wanted to create a millimeter dimension, you would have to change this to a value with the mm at the end. But for inches, I can just enter in the 9 and hit enter. Next, I want to create a copy of this line on all 3 sides. I'm going to do that by using the circular sketch pattern. And I'm going to click in the parameters box and choose the origin as the reference point for our circular pattern. And then I'll just choose the entities to pattern box and select the arc here. We want to remove this add spacing dimension option and reduce this to 3. And we want to keep that equal spacing selected and the 360 degrees as well. And click OK. Next, we'll create some fillets using the Sketch Fillet tool. And I just want to set the fillet parameters to 0.6 inches. And we just want to make sure this Keep Corners Constrained option is checked. Now there are 2 different ways to create a sketch fillet. You can either choose the corner at which the fillet is at, or you can choose 2 arc segments and create the sketch fillet that way. In this case, we want to fillet the top corner by this corner point. You may notice that there's no preview showing. Because of the way this top point is constrained, if we actually choose 2 of the arc segments, we'll actually lose some of the relations. So we want to create the fillet by selecting the top point. Unfortunately, we can't do that as it won't populate the fillet. So we'll first start by clicking this bottom point, creating the fillet, and then that's going to allow us to select this top point again and create that fillet as well. For the bottom right corner, you'll notice that it's actually trying to create a fillet in the triangle instead of between the 2 arc segments. So we can just click on the 2 arc segments and create the fillet. If you did create the top fillet first by selecting the arc segments, you may notice that the entire sketch has now turned blue and says underdefined. If you've done that, you may just want to go back, undo the sketch fillets, and start the procedure the same way that I've done it here. And that'll allow you to keep the sketch fully defined. Next, I want to add mounting holes for this plate. So I'm going to select the circle tool and draw in a circle on this center line. And I'll go ahead and give this a dimension of 3/8 of an inch. And I want to space it from the top of the arc to the center of the circle by 0.4 inches. But you'll notice that when I select the center of the circle and the arc, it actually dimensions from the center of the arc, which is not what I want. So we'll go ahead and delete out that dimension, click on the center point of the circle, and hold down the Shift key. And this is going to dimension to the outside of the arc. And we'll set that dimension to 0.4 inches. And next, to finish the profile of the sketch, we actually want to create this mounting hole on all three corners. And we'll do that using the circular sketch pattern. For the parameters, I want to choose the origin once again. Reduce this instance count down to 3. And we'll leave that add spacing dimension unchecked as well. And for the entities to pattern, we'll choose the circle and click OK. And you'll notice this comes in under defined. To fully define it, I'll just go ahead and control select the center point of that circle and the center line there and make these two coincident. And once we make that point coincident to that center line, we'll just add a dimension from the center, and once again holding down Shift to the outside of this arc. And I just want to make sure that's normal too. And set that to 0.4 inches. And you may be wondering why we didn't use the use spacing dimension option on the circular pattern. In some cases it works well. In this case it wasn't going to work well, and that's why we had to come in and add the relation as well as the dimension for the circular pattern. Lastly, before we exit a sketch, I just want to show what will happen if we add in one more dimension once this is fully defined. You get this error message of making the dimension driven, which is just going to mean it's a reference dimension, or we can leave it driving. If you leave it driving, you can now see several errors in the sketch. It's going to show either overdefined or no solution found, and it'll try to indicate where the problem areas are. If I go back in and delete this height out, it'll go back to being fully defined. Now we want to create our extrusion from the sketch, so we'll go back in the Features tab and choose Extruded Boss Base. And we're just going to set this to a height of 1/4 inch. And we'll leave this end condition as blind. We also have the option of changing the direction, but in this case we'll leave it in the default direction and click OK. And next we'll create an extruded cut on this front face. And that flat face becomes our sketch plane. Once again, I'll just hit the space bar and double click the normal to make this a little bit easier to work with. We're going to be choosing the center point slot tool. Drop it in at the origin. And you'll notice if you keep this vertical, it'll automatically add in that vertical relation. And click once more to add in the slot. Then I'll go ahead and give this dimensions. I want to give this a width by clicking on the two opposite lines of 3/4 inch. And then I want to measure a height of 2 inches from the top of the arc to the bottom of the arc here. And I'll do that once again by holding down the Shift key and clicking both arcs. And we'll set that at 2 inches. Next, I want to create another slot next to this one. So once again, I'll choose that center point straight slot tool, draw out another vertical line, and drop in another slot. And this slot will have a width of 1/4 inch. And in this case, I'll dimension an internal height just by selecting the center line of 1.5 inches. Next, I want to dimension this away from the other slot, center to center, by 3/4 inch. I want to select the center point of this slot and Control select the origin and choose to make these two horizontal. Lastly, I want to create a copy of this slot on the other side here. We'll do that by using the Mirror Entities tool, but before we do that, we need a line to mirror this slot about. Unfortunately, although we have a center line in the slot tool, you can't use these for the Mirror Entities command. So we'll just go ahead and grab the center line tool and draw in a center line collinear to the center of that straight slot. Next, we'll choose the Mirror Entities. Choose the slot for the entities to mirror. Make sure that copy option is selected, and we'll choose to mirror about that top center line. And click OK. Now, since we created this as an extruded cut, if we exit the sketch, it'll automatically populate an extruded cut. Since we have three separate closed profiles, it has no problem populating this extrusion. We could leave this as blind if we want, change the dimension, and it'll extrude up to any depth that we want. But in this case, we're going to change the end condition from the pull-down menu to through all. The end conditions can also be accessed by right-clicking in the workspace and choosing the correct end condition. Then we can go ahead and exit out of the cut extrude. And there we have our completed camber plate.